Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, we begin the second perek of Masechta Sukkah, Daf Chof Amud Beis. Zog the Heilige Mishnah, Hayashon Tachas Amite Besukkah, if one sleeps under the bed in a sukkah, Lo Yotze Yedei Chevase. He's not Yotze as Chiyuv because he's not sleeping in a sukkah. Under the bed, it's considered to be an oil for itself. He's like under a roof of a tent for itself, and he's not sleeping inside the sukkah. The Achrayim ask an interesting question. Why does the Gemara say, Lo Yotze Yedei Chevase? He wasn't Yotze as Chiyuv. Is there any specific obligation to sleep a certain amount in the sukkah? If you didn't sleep under the sukkah a certain amount, so you're not Yotze Chiyuv and you have to do it again to sleep over inside the sukkah? You're not allowed to sleep outside of the sukkah, but there's no specific chiyuv of sleeping inside the sukkah a certain amount. So why does it say Lo Yotze Yedei Chevase? It should have said that it's usher to sleep under the bed in the sukkah. So some Achrayim answer that later in the Perek we'll have the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that says that when it comes to eating in the sukkah, there is actually a specific amount of su'udas that you're supposed to eat, 14 su'udas during the 7 days of Sukkot. And according to his opinion, same comes to sleeping in the sukkah, that every day you have to sleep a certain amount in the sukkah. And therefore the Mishnah says if you slept under the bed, you have to go back in the sukkah and sleep again in the sukkah to be Yotze Chiyuv. So the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda argues and he says, it was customary for us, we slept under the bed in front of the elders, the Zekanim, and they didn't comment about this. They didn't tell us that it's any issue to sleep inside the sukkah, under the bed. Rab Shimon said, the story was with Tavi, the Eved, he's an Eved Kanani of Rabbi Gamliel, that he slept under the bed in the sukkah. And Rabbi Gamliel is a Zekanim. Rabbi Gamliel said to Zekanim, Re'isem, Tevi Avdi, did you see Tevi, my servant, Shu Talmud Chacham? Look, he's a Talmud Chacham, v'yedeya, and he knows, Sha'avadim Peturim in a sukkah, that a Evet Kanani is exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah. Lefichach Yashan Hu Tachas Amita, and therefore he is sleeping under the sukkah. Well, and by the way, we learned out of here that someone that sleeps under the sukkah is not Yotze Chiyuv. So the interesting thing over here is, if he knew that he's potter from the sukkah, he doesn't have to sleep inside the sukkah, so why didn't he go inside the house and sleep there? So Taisus over here brings, Yerushalmi, Taisus brings this, that he was there. If you look at the end of the Taisus Re'isem, that he wanted to listen to the words of the Chachamim inside the sukkah, so he stayed there and he slept there in the sukkah, but he knew he was potter, so he slept under the bed. According to this Taisus, some Mefarshim say a very nice vart regarding the raya that Rabbi Yehuda brought, that you could sleep under the sukkah. He said, look, we slept under the sukkah and the Chachamim, the Zekanim, didn't say anything. So what's the answer to Rabbi Yehuda's raya? So they say that, according to Taisvis, the answer is that when they slept under the sukkah, why did they sleep there under the bed, that is? When they slept under the bed, the reason was because there was so many people, there was such a crowd in the sukkah, that some of them squished under the bed. And they stayed there to listen to the Chachamim, and they fell asleep. They slept there under the bed. So now because they were only there to listen to the Chachamim, so there's a klala, isuk b'mitzvah, patim and a mitzvah. They're there to learn Torah, and if they're going to leave, they're not going to be able to fulfill this mitzvah. So therefore, they're potter from the mitzvah of sukkah, and that's why the Chachamim didn't say anything. But really, if you have m'chayiv in the mitzvah to sleep in the sukkah, you're not supposed to sleep under the bed. But it doesn't have the height of 10 tefachim. As we learned earlier, there was a whole sugya on Daf Yud discussing an oil that's inside a sukkah. The issue is only when you have an oil that has the minimum height of 10 tefachim. But if it doesn't, so then any structure that you're under it inside a sukkah is not an issue. So over here, we assume that a bed is not high 10 to under the bed is not 10 tefachim high. So what's the issue that they sleep under the bed in the sukkah? So the answer is Tirgum Shmuel b'mita asara. So Shmuel explains, yeah, you're right. We have to say that this Mishnah is speaking about a bed that has the height of 10 tefachim under the bed, and that's why it's an issue. Now the Gemara is going to bring up a Mishnah regarding a completely different subject, regarding tumah by oil that we've brought up a few times before, and then regarding para aduma, and eventually we're going to come back from there to Rabbi Yehuda and our Mishnah. We learned in the Mishnah Masechta Olis, Echad chur shechareruhu mayim. So before I begin the Mishnah inside, so as we had before, the klal, when you get to the concept of a tumas oil, is that anything that's inside a tent under the same roof as a mace, if there's a space of a tefach by a tefach, so then it's mekabel tumah there. And it also separates from the tumah that's outside. So what kind of an oil are we speaking about? So this Mishnah discusses an oil that was not created by a human being, but it became on its own, b'dei shemayim, it's just the space of a tefach opened up in a certain area. And it gives a few examples for this. Chayr shechareru mayim, a hole that was formed through the water. That the might of the water created this hole in that area. Oy shratzim, or there were shratzim, there was the creeping things that came and ate away at something and created this hole. Oy shachlasim malachas, or the saltiness of the ground ate away at that area and there's a hole there. V'chein madbech avanim, also a stack of rocks, or a pile of rocks, and there's a gap of a tefach inside. V'chein soya shokaitis, a stack of pieces of wood, and it has a gap of a tefach inside. So all of them mahil ala tumah. This is considered to be an opening, an area that creates the oil for a tumah, and it has all the halachas of tumah inside, and it separates from what's outside, and so on. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol oil, she'ein hasi b'dei adam, any oil that's not created by a person, ein oil, is not an oil. The halacha of an oil is only something that a person made, not something that was made b'dei shemayim. My time with Rabbi Yehuda, what's the source for Rabbi Yehuda says? Yalef, oil, mi mishkan. Yehuda learns out what it says oil, regarding tumas oil, from oil that it says by the Mishkan. Ksiv acha zeis hateira adam ki yamus ba'oil. The halacha of a person that dies inside an oil, the halacha of tumas oil. Ksiv hasam, by the Mishkan it says vayifreis es ha'oil ala Mishkan. So he spread the oil, which is the riyos, that it's called an oil, creates a tent on the Mishkan. Ma'ala alam b'dei adam, just like there the oil was created by a human being. Afkan b'dei adam. So to here the tumas oil is only regarding oil created by a person. That's the source of Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbanan disagree, and they say oil riba. When the Torah writes by the parsha, it's in the parshas Sukkah, in the beginning over there, the parsha of Paraduma, and there's where it says the tumah of oil, and it says so many times the word oil, so it's marbe that any type of oil, whether created by the other, whether created by the shemayim, is an oil. The Gemara asks on this a contradiction of Yehuda's opinion. V'sava Rabbi Yehuda, does Rabbi Yehuda hold that kol oil she'ein hasi b'dei adam, that wasn't created by a person, ein oil, does not have the halacha of tumas oil? But Aminu will ask you a contradiction, and here the Gemara brings a Mishnah Masechta Paraduma Para, where it talks about the Paraduma. And there's an interesting thing regarding the Paraduma. The Gemara brings this in the beginning of Masechta Yuma, that Paraduma, the Kayin that sprays the water, the Paraduma, is allowed to be a full yain, meaning he went to the mikveh that day, and he doesn't have to wait until at night in order to be tahir, to be able to do the sprinkling of the waters of the Paraduma. The tzaddikim, they held that the kayin that does the zrik of the paraduma has to wait until at night. So in order to negate the opinion of the tzaddikim, the chachamim said that every kayin that does the paraduma should be a tvul yom. He taiveled that day. Right? So therefore, what they would do is they did all kinds of things because of this leniency, that we're using a person that is at full yom. So we're concerned that we might come to be makel and lenient in other areas of tumah regarding the person that's doing the paraduma. So they created many stringencies regarding the paraduma, not to come to be lenient in any other area of tumah. One of them is, we added in the beginning of Yuma, that we separate this Kayin Gadol for 7 days, and every one of those 7 days they sprayed on him the waters of the paraduma, and the waters of the paraduma that was sprayed on him. So over here, they had a child that he would be the one to fill up the water for this para aduma, to be 100% sure that this water that's going to be used to spray this kayin that's separating for 7 days did not come with any contact to tumah. So this child had to be held in a place which was totally pure, no susceptibility to any tumah whatsoever. So exactly how they kept this child safe in a place removed from any tumah is the subject of this Mishnah right over here. So, Chatzeiros hayebenuyos b'Yerushalayim agab esela. There was a courtyard that was built in Yerushalayim on top of rocks that were there from Sheshis and Mebreshis, and therefore there's no tumah in that area. And besides that, v'tachteihem cholol, and this courtyard was built, below it was cholol, was open, empty space. Because if you have, even though, this was already rocks that were there from Sheshis and Mebreshis, but as an additional chumrah, to be 100% sure that there's no doubt whatsoever that there might have been someone buried under there. So the halach is, if someone is buried, so the tumah comes out up. If you go on top of that tumah, it makes you tummy. Unless there's a space of a tefach, of a oil, a tefach, so that opening creates a separation, and even if someone is buried under there, you do not become tummy. So, when they built this courtyard in Yerushalayim, besides the fact that it was built on these rocks that are there from Sheshis and Mebreshis, he also created this gap of a tefach. They built it like with domes, on top of these domes that created this space. That was the chumrah. And then, Mevi'in Noshin, Ubrais, they would bring the women that were pregnant, V'yeldes Sham, and they would give birth to their baby over there. And then Magadlais B'neim Sham, they would raise their children in that place without leaving there. Lepara, to be used for the para aduma. Umvi'in Shvarim, and then they brought oxen. Valgabein Dalsais, and on top of the oxen they put a door or a wide plank of wood. V'tinoikis Yeshvin al Gabein, and then they would sit down the child on top of him. Yet they had to take the child now from this area to go to the spring of water to get the water for the para aduma. So when they took him, they wanted to take him on top of this plank of this, or this door on this ox, that he should not become tameh from wherever he's passing through. So he has this door that he's sitting on top of it, so that creates a separation of oil that he's on top of it, and whatever is below is not going to make him tameh. The kaises shall even be yedayim, and they use a cup that's made from stone, which is something that's not susceptible to tumah. And then Igil the shiluach, they came to the shiluach, which was the spring of water that they used. And then Yardu l'teichamayim, they went down to the water, Omilum, and they filled up water, Va'alu, and they came back up, the Yashvalem, they sat back down, and they brought the water for the paraduma. Rabbi Yosi says, Mimikaimai hayem mishalshal umemala. He wouldn't even go down from where he was sitting on top of this door, on top of the ox, but he would lower down the cup with a rope to the water, to the spring, and he would lift up the water that way. Because of the concern of kever atahaim, which is a kever that may be underground, a suffix of tumah, they didn't want him to step off from this door on top of the ox to go and get it. So as Rashi explains, the machlekes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yosi is whether filling up the water for the paraduma must be done directly by hand, so then there's no choice, he has to get down, or it could be done even by just on its own, like lowering down a cup and then pulling it back up and you get water inside that way. That's the machlekes according to Rashi. Taisva says that there's no machlekes about this. You don't have to fill it up directly by hand. They're just arguing how far the extent goes, how far we're concerned about the suffix tumah. The Tanakama says we're not so concerned about the suffix tumah, and Rabbi Yosi says we are. So this is what it says in one brayse. And now comes Rabbi Yehuda, which is what we're speaking about here. And the Tanya, we learned in another brayse, Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo yoyim mevi'in dalsais. They did not bring doors to place on top of the body of the ox, and there the child would sit. El shvarim. It was just oxen. And then on top of the oxen, that's where the child sat. And the body of the ox itself was wide enough to separate from the ground below. So wherever the ox is going, so the child is sitting on top of the ox, which separates. That itself is like an oil that separates from what's below, and therefore he would not become tummy. That's good. So now the Gemara asks a question. So here there's a contradiction in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Vashvarim, now oxen, the oil this is a tent that's not created by a human being. This is the Eibusha created this ox, and the body of the ox creates a separation between the child on top of it on the ground. And what does Rabbi Yehuda say? That the Ketani, Rabbi Yehuda, that they didn't use the door on top of the body of the ox. The body of the ox itself creates that separation. So how could Rabbi Yehuda say this if Rabbi Yehuda says the rule is that any oil that's not made b'dei Adam is not an oil? That's the question here. So Chiyasar Avdimi, Amar Rabbi Lazar, he explained, Maide Rabbi Yehuda kimaloy egroif. Rabbi Yehuda is Maide that true, when it comes to an oil, usually the shiur of the size of an oil is a tefach, a handbreadth. Over here, though, what we're speaking about is an egreif, a fist, the size of a fist. Rashi actually says that we're talking over here about the size of a fist of a very big person, a ben avatiach, a certain person, a very large fist, which is as big as the face of a person. So over here, we're talking about a space of a tent that's so large. Over here, even an oil that's created b'dei shamayim is also considered an oil. So over here, between the body and the ox and the ground, the child is on top of the body of the ox and the ground, you have that large space, enough of a space of a separation, and therefore, here Rabbi Yehuda is going to be meider that it's a good oil. Tanya nami hachi, we learned this in the Braise, umayde Rabbi Yehuda will agree, b'shkifin. Shkifin is an area and a mountain of rocks where a rock tore out from the wind and it creates this opening, this space, oil there. Ubenikike aslaim, and these cracks, these deep open gaps that there are in the rocks and mountains, these are things that are created with a shemayim. But there Rabbi Yehuda would be meidas, since the gap is as big as a fist, or we're talking over here about a big fist, so there, even this is not created with a yadam, Rabbi Yehuda agrees that there's an oil here. Okay, so that answers the stira of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. But now the Gemara has another question. Vaharei deles. But what did it say before? Rabbi Yehuda says we don't put the child on top of the door on the body of the ox. Why not? Vaharei deles the yeshbo kama groifin. From the place where the door is on top of the body of the ox, between that and the bottom and the floor, there's many sizes of a groifin, of these fists, of an area for oil over here. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't place them on top of the door, you have to place them on top of the ox. Why not? Why not put them on top of the door? Like the Tanna Kama they said. So the Gemara says, so Abaye says, not that they can't do that. What Rabbi Yehuda was saying was, it's not necessary to use the doors to have the child ride on a door. You could, but you just don't have to, because the body of the ox could also serve as a separation. Rava says no, we actually shouldn't, because the body, because the door is there's going to be an issue. There is a certain gzeira of Chazal over here. What is that? We would not use doors, kol likar at all, because the child sitting on this nice big plank on top of the body of the ox becomes very comfortable there. He starts moving around, he feels very nice and safe there. So Shema Yotzi Roisha Echad Mevarev Yitame. Maybe he'll move around and stick out his head or his hand over the ground in an area where there could be a tumah, there could be a kaver there, and then he'll become tummy. The whole point is to create a separation for him. So we don't want him to be on a nice plank of wood, which is too comfortable for him to move around. That's why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there was a gzeira not to use this door, this plank of wood. V'yitame, the continuation in Amud Beis, v'yitame b'kever atahim, and it'll become tameh with the suffix tumah that there is over here if he sticks out his head or any part of his body in that area. Tanya was say that this pshat that according to Rav Yehuda there was a gzeira. We learned in a Braise, Rav Yehuda they would not use doors to place on the body of the ox because the child becomes very comfortable there. He may stick out his head or one of the limbs of his body and he'll become tameh with the suffix tumah that there is. Ella rather, mevin shvarim amitzriyim, they bring the oxen that come from Mitzrayim. Is that they have a very wide, broad body, and it's enough for the child. And the child sits on top of it, and it separates between the child and what's below. The kaises shall even be a dayan, and the child has this kais, this cup made from stone. And then, as I said before, Yigil is shiluach. They come to the shiluach, the spring water. Yardu, they go down and milim, and they fill it up. For all of yashal agabe, and then they go back onto the body of the ox. That's till here is the conclusion of this section where the Gemara brings up the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that you can use the body of the ox as a separation, and you have a greifim, you have the size of a fist, or your large fist even, that separates from the body of the ox and the ground, and therefore it's a good oil. So now the Gemara comes back and asks a contradiction to our Mishnah. V'harei mito the yeshbo kama greifim. In our Mishnah, speaking about the person sleeping under the bed inside the sukkah, the space between the bed and the floor. There is kama greifim. There's a few fistfuls that separate from that roof of the bed. to the bottom, to the floor. Utanan, Rabbi Yehuda says, that we used to sleep under the bed, and it's still considered that we're inside the sukkah. So we see that this is not an oil. Says Rashi explains, the point that the Gemara is focusing on over here is that if Rabbi Yehuda said that they could sleep in the sukkah under the bed, the reason is because the bed is an oil arai. It's not a permanent oil. So even though it has enough space under it to create an oil, because it has not only a tefach, but it has kama groifim there, but because it's an oil arai, it's not an oil. If so, say the same thing regarding an ox. The ox is not a permanent oil, it's walking around. So even if it has the space between the body of the ox and the ground, but it still shouldn't be a proper separation for the child sitting on it. So how does Rabbi Yehuda say that that's useful for the child brought for the para aduma? So the Gemara gives a few answers here. So one answer is, Shani mita, a bed is different, hoyel ulegaba asuya, because the bed is made for sleeping on top of it, not under it. So true, usually an oil in this case, even though it's a temporary oil, if there's enough space between the bed and the floor, it should be a good oil. But because it wasn't made for that purpose, it's made for sleeping on top of the bed, it's not considered to be an oil for that purpose. Frakte Gemara, shvarim nami ligabon asuyim. But an ox is also made to go on, to ride on top of the ox, not to use the space as an oil under the ox. So how can we say that the amount that there is, egroif or more, that separates from the body of the ox on the ground is considered to be an oil to separate from the child that's on top of this ox? So the Gemara says, Ki yasa Ravin Omer Rabbi Elazar. So Ravin said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, no, shani shvarim. Oxen are different. Hoyel umeginim ala royim bechama mipnei achama or biksham mipnei akshamim. The shepherds that go out in the field with the oxen, so sometimes in the summer when it's very hot, so they lie down and they're looking for a place of shade, and they may use the body of the ox to be under it for shade. Or sometimes in the rain, in the winter when it's raining and they want to stay dry, they also might use the body of an ox to keep dry. So therefore it is used under it as well. Frekte Gemara, if that's the case, hihachi mitanami, say the same thing with the bed. A bed could also be used to keep your shoes, your sandals under the bed. So it's also useful not only to sleep on it, but also for under the bed. And Rashi says, the Gemara here says specifically min olim v'sandalim, since there's a Gemara, it says that the Gemara in Baba Basra says that by Talmud Chacham, he doesn't keep things under the bed. The only things that are under the bed are shoes. Ela Marave, so Rava gives a different answer. Shani Shvarim, the oxen are different. Hoyel va'asuyin lahogein al b'nei ma'ayim shalahem. Their bodies, it creates an oil and it covers over the insides of the body of the animal. So it's the spine, the bones, or whatever, the body of the animal that the child is sitting on, which is the oil, and it covers over the body of the animal inside. And that's what it's made for. Shenemar oir ubasar talbisheni. The skin and the flesh you give me, there's the levush of the person, and with the bones and the sinews, you cover me, you protect me. It says about a human being, but the same thing is also regarding the ox, that the body of the spine and the bones of the ox cover over the insides of the animal, and therefore that's why it's considered to be an oil that's covering what's below it. But as by a bed though, it's not made primarily for that use. It's made to sleep on top of it, so there it's not an oil. Or we could say another answer, and this is something the Gemara brought before already. Rabbi Yehuda that allows to sleep under the bed inside a sukkah follows his opinion in the first mission of the Masechta. The Amma, he said, sukkah diras kva beinon. A sukkah has to be a permanent structure. That's why Rabbi Yehuda held that a sukkah could be higher than 20 amas. This is according to Rabbi's interpretation. So here in our Gemara we see that it's following Rabbi's reasoning for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion of that Mishnah that Ramban pointed out. There was a few different opinions there, Rabbi, Rav, and Rab Zera, if I remember correctly. So here the Gemara is following Rabbi's opinion. And therefore, so the bed is a temporary dwelling. It is an oil, but it's a temporary dwelling. The sukkah oil kva, and a sukkah is a permanent structure. So when you have a permanent structure and inside is a temporary oil, the temporary oil does not annul the place where you're in, that you're primarily in the permanent structure. So even if usually Rabbi Yehuda holds that you could use a temporary oil as an oil to separate from the tumah that's below it, like it is in the case of sitting on top of the body of the ox. That's usually. But when you're in a temporary oil inside a permanent structure, so then we say that you're essentially inside the permanent structure, and the temporary oil does not separate from that. Oil doesn't come and annul the fact that you're in an oil kva. Fragt the Gemara on this pshat, but for Rab Shimon the Amar Nami Sukkah diras kva binon. Rab Shimon agrees to Rabbi Yehuda that a sukkah has to be a permanent structure, and v'asi oil arai u'mevatel oil kva. And Rab Shimon holds that you can't sleep on the bed, that even if it's a temporary structure, nevertheless you're not in the sukkah, you're under this inside this temporary oil, even though the sukkah is oil kva. So we see that this reasoning is not true. So the Gemara says, that's not a question. Baha pligi. They argue about this very point. Rab Shimon says even a temporary oil inside the permanent structure could annul the fact that you're in the permanent structure, now you're in the temporary oil. That because you're in a permanent sukkah, the temporary oil that you are under the bed does not annul the fact that you're inside the sukkah. So this is what the argument is about. So he recorded the story of Tevi Avdai, the Eved of Rabbi Gamliel. So Tanya Amar Rab Shimon said, from the talking of Rabbi Gamliel that he shared this incident, we learned Shnei Dvarim, 2 points. We learned that an Eved Kanani, even though he's chayav in some mitzvahs, but he's potter from Sukkah. And we also learned Shayashan Tachas Amiteh, one that sleeps under the sukkah, the bed that is Lo Yotze Dechevasa, is not Yotze's obligation. That's the terminology that Rab Shimon used when he reported this that he learned from Rabbi Gamliel. So the Gemara asks on one particular word there, the lema. Why didn't he say midvarav shel Rabbi Gamliel, from the words of Rabbi Gamliel, the words that he taught us? What is misichasa? Misichasa means from the conversation with him. Why did he use that expression? So the Gemara answers, milse agavorche kamash malan. While he's telling us this concept, so agavorche is teaching us as follows: Ki ha the Amar Rav Acha bar Ada va'amri lo Amar Rav Acha bar Ada Amarav Amnuna Amarav. How do I know that even the conversation with a Talmid Chacham needs to be studied to see what they're teaching you? You have a tree that's near the water, and even the leaves benefit from it, not only the fruits. In other words, even the secondary things on the tree also benefit. The same thing also, even from the conversations of a Talmid Chacham, you can learn from it as well. Okay, I am in a camp over here. Sorry for the background noise in the last few minutes.